Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Lunch and Lore. I'm Tormented by Gnomes. Joining me is NinjaManMat, my lifelong friend and co-creator of the world of Anacra. Matt, how are you this fine Friday?
I'm great, lifelong friend. I had some good breakfast, some good lunch, and I'm ready for lore. How about you?
Same. I will be slurping down my coffee to get the lore juices flowing. But in today's episode, we're going to talk about a concept that has only shown up thus far in the Anacra timeline once in a major way, but it's actually present the whole time, and it's going to have more ramifications throughout the history of the four kingdoms of Anacra. And that concept is mantles of power. And to give a brief description of what that means, you may be familiar if you've read enough fantasy literature. A mantle of power is this title or role or aura that can be transferred from one person to another. Some examples would include, like in politics, a certain seat or chair or title is not always, it changes who holds that title, and whenever that title changes, that person inherits all the powers and privileges of that position. In fantasy
That is some
literature,
relevant sauce.
there must always be a lich king. The Dutchman must always have a captain, and whoever is the captain of the Flying Dutchman gets certain powers. They get command over the vessel, etc. But that can change from person to person by undergoing a certain ritual or rites or combat, etc.
Yeah, I think Highlander as well.
Yeah.
There can only be, although there doesn't always have to only be one, but it's one of those things where the whenever I started talking about mantles, and it usually confuses people who aren't super familiar, I think, with the fantasy aspect of it. When people think mantle, they either think that little baseboard or upper area of your wall, or they think of that little half cape that you kind of use to cover your shoulders.
Which is
Uh,
actually a more apt description, right? Because it's this thing that descends upon you.
which is what I was going to say. Whenever I talk or try to explain mantles, I always think, imagine if I put a little cape over you, but that cape gave you the power to, and I explain whatever the power is. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay. And it's a little bit easier having this shroud of power that overflows you and then fills you and lets you do all kinds of glorious and possibly terrible things, depending on what you do with it.
Mm-hmm. In the history of Anacra, during the first day, which is where Casters and Castles, Quest for the Book of Dawn, etc., takes place, there are a handful of noteworthy mantles we can talk about. There can be all sorts of different mantles of power, but there's a few that are kind of really big picture. And the first one is sovereignty. So we've got the four elemental sovereigns, the gods of creation, who did most of the shaping of the world of Anacra and have played a key role in its mythology and its history throughout all time. But a few hundred years ago, one of those sovereigns, Arakura, the sovereign of stone, was killed by Uzul the Destroyer. And whenever we talk about the death of Arakura, we always say that the sovereign of Earth was not annihilated, right? The
Just
Arakura's power,
discorporated.
yeah, discorporated, which means to no longer have a body.
The avatar was slain, but the power remains.
Yeah. The avatar is almost a good example of a mantle, except that it's also a
Yeah.
reincarnation, so it's slightly different.
And we're talking about bending avatars, not big blue people avatars. Although that, I guess,
Yes.
could still technically be relevant depending on how you see science fiction and assuming bodies and things like that.
True, true. So, Arakura, the Sovereign of Stone, is slain. The element of Earth still exists. Arakura's power still exists on a subconscious, empathic level throughout the world, but the Earth element is no longer able to create an avatar of itself to walk around enacting its will. Well, what's
But
supposed
that
to
being said, yeah, the sovereigns have not just their initial duties when crafting the world, but they have continued duties in their power, whether it is ambient and ever flowing or being used directly. They have certain duties and jobs that need to be upheld. And please continue, Joseph.
Yeah. And so it's not like this was a contingency plan that was like it's nobody ever said, okay, in the event of the death of a sovereign, we have the following contingency plan to, pass down power. That never happened. What happened was the very nature of elemental sovereignty means that that role of being the advocate of the earth, the incarnation of the earth, that role still existed. Just like nobody sat down and said, okay, we're going to have these sovereigns and they're going to do this, this, and this. It was just like an inherent function of what it means to be an elemental sovereign, was that this other title, this role still existed. And that role of being the second or the inheritor of a sovereign's power is called being a suzerain. A suzerain is somebody who, I think we're using that strictly for sovereigns right now. Is that right, Matt?
That's the intention. I mean,
Yeah.
things are ever flowing, and we'll see where we end up
Mm-hmm. But right
finally.
now, that's the word we're using to refer to somebody who is fulfilling the role of an elemental sovereign who is not themselves the original elemental sovereign.
Or who is in essence taking up the mantle, as we said,
Mm-hmm.
of one of those great beings that was part of the inception of the world of Anacra.
Now, what happened after Anacra died was the mantle of sovereignty passed to her son Romius. Uh, Romius did not use the mantle of power to immediately take up the duties of his slain mother. It's not that he squandered it, it's that he used it for completely different purposes.
Which we
Instead
have
of,
discussed before. Yeah.
yeah, so he used that to gain power and insight into the Emerald Tablets, the source code of reality, and then transformed himself into something new entirely, the Overlord of Death, which was not a role that existed, it was not a title. He made that himself by editing the source code of the universe, but he used his mantle of sovereignty to do so. And
It's kind of
once,
like how we've talked about. We've had questions like, well, could anybody just spend, a number of years? Imagine like a great elven wizard who goes, I'm going to sit down for the next 500 years and see what I can do about messing with the source code of the universe. And that's absolutely something that if you could find the little tears and pull upon them and end up making something of it, you probably could get somewhere. One of the reasons why Ramius was able to make such an impactful change in the amount of time that he had was in no small part due to that level of effective divinity he had with carrying the mantle of the sovereign of earth.
the sovereigns are the ones who set forth the tablets in the first place, and so because he inherited the admin account of one of the sovereigns, he was able to do actual edits. Most great sages who investigate the Emerald Tablets, they do unlock great power over the universe, but it's not through changing the rules, it's through understanding the rules and being able to use them more effectively.
Exactly. And it's good to note that, like we said, even though a sovereign is discorporated, their power still remains and they still can affect significant, albeit subtle changes in the world, especially someone like Arakura, who was a very ponderous and slow moving, but very impactful sovereign. When you have a suzerain taking over their mantle, you're really just giving effectively an avatar or a body to that power. Although it's I think you can agree, mate, it's probably more like a 0.5. It would be like an avatar 2.0, but it's less like, oh yeah, this is the new and improved version, and more like, okay, this is a smaller model. This is not what we had initially, had planned for this, but it'll work.
Yeah, a suzerain is not as strong as the original sovereigns under most circumstances. Like, I'm sure that if you were some sort of new super mega space god and then you inherited the mantle, you might be overall stronger. But in terms of just pound for pound being an elemental sovereign, it's not the same. It is
Yeah,
definitely a step down. You still have access to the full power of the elements of Earth, but what power of that is vested in your body and under your direct control is not nearly the same as your stat block isn't as big, right? If Arakura had a stat block and a suzerain had a stat block, they wouldn't match up.
yeah.
So, on that note, Romius forsook the mantle of the suzerain of Earth when he became the Overlord of Death. And at this time, unless I've forgotten something, Matt, that mantle of power of the Earth Sovereign is not being worn. Nobody has that.
We definitely haven't installed another. I feel like we've had ideas, but nothing has been for Earth concretely set yet. Uh, and I wanted to touch on. We said that Romius took up the mantle, and I'm wondering for suzerains especially, because I
Mm-hmm.
know we're going to be getting into other mantles as we go on throughout today's lore discussion. But for a suzerain, I would assume that it's not something that if I think that it's more the next, the hand touches the beacon kind of a thing. The mantle is there, and you have to be a target, or you have to have prerequisites that meet the requirements for doing it, but it's not like it just falls upon you and now you have it, I would assume, is what we're going with, right?
Yeah, if some peasant happened to stumble upon it and touch it, it's not likely. Like, it could, but if it did just glom onto them, something's going on, right?
Yeah, but I feel like you kind of have to have there needs to be some groundwork for only certain beings can actually even apply for the job. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like not anybody can just submit an application for this thing.
Well, thus far, all suzerains that we have formulated have been actual descendants of the sovereigns. They've been titans or
Yes,
demigods or stuff like that.
some kind of progeny or something. Yeah.
Yeah. I believe theoretically it should be possible to steal a mantle.
Oh, interesting.
But the dungeon master don't know how you would do that. If I had to come up with an evil plot about trying to steal the earth mantle, it would certainly involve a deep understanding of the emerald tablets. It'd be like finding an exploit, right? You wouldn't be doing an edit, you'd be finding a loophole in the code.
Or get a wonder stave, and that might do it.
Right, yeah, or some ridiculous amount of wild magic. Whenever you need to break the rules, wild magic is always a good go-to.
It's a good start, yeah.
But in most cases, you have to be blessed and chosen by the earth in order to become the suzerain of earth. You wouldn't be able to stumble into it. Maybe some rando with no heroic powers could inherit that mantle, but if so, it would be at the will of the earth, and so it'd be some sort of big chosen one prophecy crap.
Exactly.
Because otherwise, again, you need to do extraordinary measures in order to successfully steal the damn thing.
Yeah, and it would be less like I think a prophet because we're big on Anacra not doing fulfilling prophecies, and if it is, it's because there's a reason for it, not because it was prophesized, but because you meet the conditions for this recipe. It would be less like, oh, farm boy John was always meant to ascend this mantle, and everything is going according to reason, and it's just that farm boy John's really good with rocks, and it turns out that he's got a love for all things in the world, and he is the perfect applicant. It's just kind of how like what was his name? Oh gosh, not the first Green Lantern, but at least in most of our stories, Hal Jordan, how he's apparently the most willful person in the entire DC cosmology, and he's this really arrogant fighter pilot that has to learn the meaning of love, and it's just like, yeah, sure, yeah, you're the best for this job. That makes sense.
If somebody made a prophecy about, if you're born under a certain set of stars with this, and like if you've all these things. They're not saying, hey, I've seen the future and this is going to happen. And the way you'll know this is the person is by seeing all these things. They'll say, hey, under the conditions in which a person is born under these circumstances, then they'll be able to do X, Y, and Z rather than I have seen it and this is how you shall know them. But we've talked about prophecy before on the show.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So essentially, if you are bearing the mantle of if you're a suzerain, an elemental suzerain, then your stat block gets a huge upgrade. You get all sorts of new powers and stuff. You don't get replaced by the stat block of an elemental sovereign, but your stat block absolutely gets cranked up to CR20, CR30, something in that neighborhood.
Oh, yeah. If you weren't elemental, you become an elemental, all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about we've got some future plots in mind where the concept of suzerainty is going to come up again, but let's talk a little bit about Liban, because this is something where we haven't nailed down where this is on the timeline, but it's definitely something we've talked about, and it's a slightly different set of circumstances for somebody to become a suzerain. Liban is wrestling. Were you about to say something, Matt?
No, just agreeing with you.
Yeah. Liban is currently wrestling the one flesh underneath the fifth continent of Tamrian. And this is the status quo as of the quest for the Book of Dawn. One concept we have introduced the possibility of, but have not further fleshed out, is that Liban could surrender their personhood, but not their power and presence. Essentially, making sure that some gigantic elemental sovereign-sized stat block is still wrestling the one flesh, but it's almost on autopilot, right? Liban is investing their power there, but not their mind and presence. And if that's the case, Liban could actually sort of divide themselves and create one or more suzerains. And the reason I say or more is because this is an odd circumstance where Liban isn't truly discorporated.
Exactly.
So it wouldn't be a true suzerain of water, but you could get some sort of a demi process thereof where there's all these mini mantles to be handed out, and each of these people inherits some of the personhood of the element of water. They'd be able to act as messengers, envoys, avatars, proxies, all sorts of different roles.
It's
Or,
almost like deputizing. Instead
yeah,
of like actually like
yeah,
giving someone a mantle of power, you give them a badge, and this badge carries the weight of my office, kind of a thing.
right. And that badge is also like now you're sort of me and I'm sort of you. Like it's a personality thing as well as just
Yeah.
you're allowed to do this. It's like my divine presence will extend through you. I will get to experience the world as you. Liban is the sort of sovereign who would send some of these deputies out to go enact change in the world, and others to just be like, look, I all I get to do is wrestle this giant space flea from nowhere all the time. I would like to enjoy reality a little bit. So, you know,
Responding to Lightfoot's question, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off there,
no,
mate.
you're good.
The question was, does such a divide also come with a measure of vulnerability? And that's absolutely what we've been discussing. What effective Levon would be doing is by leaving their avatar to battle the one flesh, we decided it would act as sort of like a prison. You'd have, instead of how when Arakura was discorporated and their body, their avatar, ended up turning into the giant mountain range that was inhabited by the dwarves that came to be known as Londakar. The body of Liban, their remains would be left as kind of this behemoth prison of sorts, and their consciousness and their power would be divided amongst many instead of one. So, kind of like how Joe was saying, instead of having a very incredibly powerful CR30 suzerain, you'd have various, probably CR20 like mini suzerains, where they're numerous, they are powerful, but they don't quite have as much of a kick as a full suzerain.
As for vulnerability to Liban themselves, I would treat what Liban leaves behind almost as a non-sentient elemental. Like it's a prison, but it's a prison that
Yes,
fights you, right? It's not just sitting there.
exactly.
So there's
Yeah, exactly.
this Leviathan elemental that is left behind to keep the one flesh pinned. And Liban's consciousness ends up being distributed across all these people, where they're each partially themselves, partially Liban. Whenever you kill one of those, I think it would diminish Liban's consciousness and presence. Uh, but at the same time, just as Arakura's will lives on, even if in a less sentient fashion throughout the earth itself, if you cut a puddle of water, what happens, right? It just sort of splits around. So I think Liban, the more times that you kill one of Liban's proxies, the more literally fluid Liban's identity and consciousness becomes.
I
Less
could
of a
totally
person and more of
see
like a presence or an energy that can descend on anyone. Go ahead.
they. Oh yeah, absolutely. They become, like you said, they effectively, the more of those avatars you kill, the more discorporate they become. The less of an actual and sentience, not the right word, because you still have sentience even as a discorporated entity. Uh, their impact, how we talked about how you need form in Anacra in order to make change. Having form, it makes you powerful in that moment. It's kind of like if you're here in person at a game table, I can reach out and move my piece. Whereas if I'm on stream and I'm telling Joe, hey, if you could move my piece here, please, he may not know exactly what I want to do, even though I could probably handle a lot of things being the DM on stream. I can't affect direct change. So it's not the greatest analogy, but if you have more of these pieces, these deputies that are being discorporated, Liban is having a less of a personal effect on the world and becomes more like their fallen brethren or sister, Arakura, where they return to being part of the energy of the world. And I could actually see a really interesting campaign scenario one day where there is a big bad looking to discorporate all of the avatars of Arakura and thereby trying to weaken the prison and free rather the one flesh. That would be a really interesting scenario
The
to delve
question
into.
there, though, is if you discorporate enough of them, does the prison weaken? Or with each one that you discorporate, does the Leviathan grow like stronger?
It's totally
The
possible.
way I would handle that is each time you kill one, the Leviathan becomes more sentient, but because of the way it's been like divided, it is this angry primal thing, right? It's all of Liban's proxies sort of represent, I don't want to say the more civilized, but the more I want to talk with people, be diplomatic, experience the universe. And the Leviathan represents just the primal, crushing
Raw
depth and
power.
rage of the
Yeah.
ocean. And so
Here's my counter. I would say if you, like you said, if you just cut water, where does it go? It just goes back into, being in the water. If you were to just destroy a deputy or a suzerain in that regard, yeah, the energy would flow back into the Titan. But if you were somehow able to remove that suzerain from the water, capture it, and disperse its energy in a way where it couldn't go back where it came from, that might
evaporate
change
instead of
things.
cutting.
Exactly. That might change things.
So if you just stab them all, it's not going to work. But if you have some sort of evil magical process, then yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, agreed. I could see a situation where an ignorant villain is just trying to frag all of them, and the more they do, like the angrier and more dangerous Tamrian gets, because the Leviathan underneath is becoming more primal and more angry, and
Yes.
eventually will just wipe out civilization on the island to keep the One Flesh imprisoned. But
Yes.
said big bad may not know that, because they don't know how to
Yeah,
do magical evaporation.
absolutely.
Vindur has so far managed to avoid having to do any such thing. He's got his offspring, the Four Winds, and his various other titans. He'd prefer to keep his power vested thusly. Sin is also, at the time, incarnate upon the earth, ruling over Sharon with a brass fist. So, until further updates, there's no suzerainty for those two.
Basically, if you want to avoid having a suzerain, just build a giant city and lock yourself in it and say, no entry, please.
Yes,
Let me
that
do
seems to be the trick.
my thing.
Now, I imagine Titans can do something similar, right? Because now I sort of want to talk about what a mantle is. In my brain of brains, to use one of Matt's phrases, I think that a mantle is basically, it's almost the spark of godhood. And we've talked
Yes.
about how godhood is, it's a wide spectrum in Anacra, running from minor local spirits and mini deities, like the spirit of this river is the same as Liban, the sovereign of water, just at an utterly different scale, but the substance
Yes.
is roughly the same. And yeah, Liban has a more important status, but Liban isn't inherently different. Liban is just the ultimate water spirit that encompasses the entire world and therefore has more power.
Kind of
So,
borrowing from, I think, third edition, you and I had come up with a ranking system that it wasn't like necessarily, like Dragon Ball Z power levels. We had uh, whether you were like a rank 4 deity versus a rank 5, because we were basing it off of, if you're rank 1, you're animals, you're commoners, like you're just anything that just is inhabiting the world and is not seeking to make any great change. It's just living there. Rank 2 would be like your standard up and coming adventurers, powerful monsters such as just bears and things like that, stuff that you don't want to mess with. When you're getting into level 3, that's when things are getting crazy. This is monsters. You're getting into like
dragons.
dragons, minotaurs, things that like can affect great change in the world, whether through their power or cunning. And then when you get into rank 4, that's like the first kind of divine rank. You're looking at your titans. You're looking at your oh god, what were we calling them? The greater fiends, like
Yeah,
things.
Archfey, great spirits,
Archfey,
archfiends.
exactly. Elementals, genies, things like that. Stuff
Some
that can.
of the infernals clock in at that rank as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Actually, most of the infernals clock in at that rank.
Absolutely. And then rank 5, you're looking at sovereigns and things that are, you could kind of see if maybe this entity isn't so powerful on its own, but if you go to its home turf and its lair, it could be incredibly powerful at changing its own dimension, and you don't want to mess with it there.
Yeah. This basically the sovereigns and the infernals at their strongest, like at the peak of their power, a couple of infernals have been tier 5 entities.
Also, I would say at this point, probably Rialta and Ramius in their courts are probably rank 5,
Yeah,
considering
on
how
the grand
powerful they
cosmic
are.
scale, they're a tier 4, but if you fight on their turf, yeah.
Yeah, you don't come, throwing punches with somebody who they literally created their own realm and devised everything within it.
Mm-hmm. And yes, rank 6 is Bren asking if you'll allow it. That's correct.
Also, it goes without saying that Shazzy Day is probably just walking around like either cusp of rank 5 at rank 4 or probably rank 5. He's incredibly powerful.
Yep. All right. So the mantle is sort of, it's not the person, but it's like all their power and all their responsibilities and such. So we've talked a little bit about what it means to be a god in Anacra and how you can be the god who is the spirit of a physical thing or of a creature. There are tulpa gods, and a tulpa is a entity that exists because people think it exists. It's this concept that if enough people believe in
Yes.
Slenderman becomes real. And
Yeah.
that logic is at work in Anacra. It's where you get a lot of hero deities. Most hero deities aren't actually the spirit of that person. It's the image of that person that the culture has raised around them. And so,
Usually.
yeah, usually there's a lot of variety when you're not talking about like the gods of creation in Anacra, who have a very, this person was created by this person, and they're very tiered and ranked and ordered, and you sort of have a good taxonomy of them. Everything else in Anacra is incredibly all over the place. So new mantles can be created the same way that new gods can be created. We've talked a little bit about what it takes if you want to become a god, and obviously you're shooting for different tiers of godhood when you're trying to achieve apotheosis. But similarly, if you create a new god, depending on where that god comes from, who they are, what they're the god of, you might have just created a mantle that can be passed down from one person to another, or taken in combat if you're like a deity of strength or warriors or something like that. Uh, and Matt, unless you had something on that, this brings me to the concept of the Huldra.
I was going to say this is an incredible segue into the seasonal mantles of the Altar Court.
Right. So there's a few different types of elves, and we still haven't done our elves episode, but the main breakdown
Oh
of elves,
yeah.
you've got the Aurai, who are the winged elves, who are not actually one of the main groups. They tend to be a smaller group. You've got the Huldra, who are the wood elves or the dusk elves. Lysha Norwellen is a Huldra. We visited the autumn court of the Huldra in Casters and Castles in our most recent season. Uh, the Huldra dwell largely, but not entirely, to the east of the northern kingdoms, in a huge forest valley called the Connacht Vale. They arrived. We have to do a brief lesson. The other types of elves are the Alfar, the Dawn elves, some of whom created Ioth, the great magical city and academy that was eventually destroyed, and invested the magic of Dawn magic. And then you've got the ones to the south. I don't remember the name of that place right off the bat, but they're the ones who enslave people with enchantment magic because they think that humans need a strong hand and guidance in order to blah, blah, blah. Then you've got the Dokelfar, the Dark Elves, who dwell largely underground and are the guardians of secret passages between the mortal world and the underworld, among other secrets. We'll talk about that at
Yep,
some
which
point.
we'll get to another time. Yes.
But the Huldra, they arrived after. The Huldra are the descendants of spirits and entities from the dawn who, when the dawn ended, had to choose physical mortal forms for themselves. And they sort of fell in love with the mortal world and with the natural beauty of the mortal world. And so they bound themselves to trees and beasts, and so they became the wood elves. They live very harmonious lives with nature. They live in tree, Teldrassil style, but without the purple to the aesthetics. They live in giant living forests. They try to.
You've seen elves in literature and media.
Yeah,
You know.
everyone knows how that works. So they arrived, and they always sort of divided themselves into season-based clans, tribes, or family groups, but it wasn't super formal until they got invaded by frost giants. A great frost giant king named Snjor wrote his palace was a glacier, like this glacier carved to have towers and siege weapons and all sorts of stuff, and he had magical control over it. He rammed it through the mountains north of the Connacht Vale, so he just parked his glacier halfway in the valley, and the doors of the glacier opened up, and frost giants and ogres and stuff charged out, and there was this huge war. And there's a lot of history. I'm going to cut to the end of it. Essentially, 4 great leaders of the Huldra went to the mountain in the middle of the Connacht Vale, and they danced and chased the spirits of the mountain for 4 days and 4 nights. And at the end of that time, they made a pact, a sacred bond with the natural spirits of the valley. Your forest spirits, various tree spirits, animals, weather, just the elemental and fey and primal energy of the valley itself. And yes, a frost giant rode a giant glacier snowboard into the Elven Kingdoms to shred the gnar and start a war.
I always love the idea of this mobile ice fortress that
Mhm.
this frost giant used in order to literally come from the continents to the north and just rain all kinds of frosty terror upon the Sutherland. Well,
I
it's still north, but southern to them.
I want to do something with that someday because like the legend is called Snor rides the glacier. That's the whole story of that battle.
One of these days, mate, we're going to need to have you just do this collection of all of these. Because again, when we're sitting down and working on things, I'm very bullet point about how I want to just get through things. And Joe writes these beautiful ballads and sonnets and tales. It's very Tolkien-esque in how he puts together all of this lore. And I feel like we need like a very Silmarillion-esque story from you one of these days where you just take all these ballads and notes and things that you've put together and just go, here you go, guys. This is all the stuff. Whenever we talk about it, just go to chapter 3, page
Mm.
1743, and you'll see the Battle of Schnord as he rides the Nar
Snor.
into the Northern Kingdom.
I mean that's what the world anvil is supposed to be when I keep it up to date. But someday. So these four Huldra leaders, they dance on the slopes of Glencroy, the heart of the valley, and they each form this pact, and each of them forms a bond with one of the four seasons, and they become the Huldra queens. You know, and that pact, that power that is invested in these elves, became a mantle that is now passed down from one Huldra queen to the next. And each of them comes with a whole bunch of, it's like, okay, you have your normal stat block, but now you've inherited the mantle of winter, so you have cold damage resistance or immunity, you get all these spell like abilities, you get some stat buffs, etc. So it's a mantle that drastically changes you as a character, but you could have it's not one that you are congratulations, you are now a literal god, right? It would be a huge power spike for you, but when it
And
is
considering oh, go ahead.
no, you go first.
Sorry, I just didn't want to move too far past this point you were making. Aside from actually increasing their own, personal power and abilities, one of the biggest things being a nature-based mantle is that you not only get your own power boost, but you have a certain amount of control over the denizens and just the very land of your either season or realm that you control.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very impactful thing, not just for you personally, but for those around you.
Yeah, you gain lair abilities essentially on steroids. You can change, you can cause trees to, if you're in your home territory and you're one of these Huldra queens, like you can control the temperature, you can summon wildlife, you can make plants grow, you can see through the eyes of birds and beasts in your domain, stuff like that. A lot of
Yeah,
mantles carry
based
this
based off
fundamental
your
power.
region. Yeah, based off your region and even the season.
Yeah, the Winter Queen is definitely going to be stronger during the winter, and will be able to change the weather to a greater extent. So these mantles are passed down from one Huldra queen to the next, and it's not always matrilineal. You don't have to be the actual child of one of the Huldra queens to inherit this mantle. It's got its own internal logic, but it's sort of like the Avatar, where one Avatar dies and then the next Avatar is born almost immediately. The mantle usually just passes right from one person to the other, alighting on some young Huldra. It doesn't have to be at the moment of their birth, but it usually descends on them pretty quick. Now, it is possible to steal these mantles or to contain them in a sacred object, but that usually only happens if there's a problem with the inheritance. And thus far in Huldra history, that has not happened, except maybe during the war between the Fey Queens. Might have happened then.
Probably did.
Anyways,
Makes
these
for a good story.
these four Huldra Queens then picked one champion to basically combine all their powers in, and so they elect or select the king of the Huldra, and so the queens are the governors. They're the ones who actually do most of the ruling, and the king is responsible for defense because the Huldra king gives up his name to inherit this incredibly powerful combined mantle of the four. It's always still tied to one season. I think the first Huldra king was a winter king, but as soon as that Huldra king dies, instead of there being a new winter king, the next king is going to be the spring king, and then summer, and so on and so forth. So there's this cycle. And so the
Whenever
whole
we say Spring King, I always think we're getting ready for a prom or something. Hey guys, get ready. Welcome in the new Spring King.
Woohoo! Yeah, Huldra prom ain't nothing to mess with. So This mantle is particularly strong, but it's derived from the selection and approval of these other four. And so the Holdra King gets power. The Holdra King's power is primarily invested in the land itself. And so their main thing is, again, they can have eyes and spies anywhere throughout the Conic Vale. They can command the trees to grab you. They're like a god on their home territory. Not nearly as strong when they leave, because whereas the queens, their power is definitely rooted in their territory, but it's also tied to the seasons. So if the Winter Queen feels like leaving her territory during the winter, she's still gonna carry that power with her. And if you met the Holdra King off of his out of the Connacht Vale, he would definitely still be stronger than your average Holdra. He'd definitely still have some buffs, but he wouldn't be as godlike as he would on his territory, because the power of his mantle is derived from the spirits of that land in which he lives.
And if we know anything about powerful denizens in Anacra, once they find out they can be killed and they have great power by staying home, they mostly just stay home.
Mm-hmm.
Because no one wants to die.
Nope. No one wants to die. We've sort of burned through a lot of the topic thus far, because I don't know, can you think of anything else major to say about these mantles of power, about the Holdra kings and queens?
I mean, a lot of the stuff I think that we have to say we're kind of holding back because at this point it's like it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, 3,000 years in the future or whatever.
So it's kind of not relevant here. It would raise more questions than it would answer, and wouldn't be incredibly tactful right now. What I will say though is, in regards to mantles in general, we've talked about how yes, they give you usually a great modicum of own personal power. I think what we're really gathering though from both the suzerains and from the Holdra is that when you get a mantle, it mainly is spreading your influence across a wider range, whether it be a world or a season or a piece of the land. A mantle of power is not just saying, "Hey, cool, I leveled up," or "I'm like incredibly powerful," but it gives you a sense of responsibility and duty to a specific type of job, whether it be safeguarding the firmament, making sure that the spring goes off without a hitch, for Haldra Prom, or whatever that may be. But it is a duty. It's not just like, oh, cool, this is a great power boost. Now I can do whatever I want. You're basically locking yourself into a contract with Anacra, and kind of like how Joe was saying, whether it be through war or otherwise, there have been some times, especially in Haldra society, where the mantle does not pass through as easily, and in a large portion of it, there is a right that you have to do when you're accepting the mantle of being a queen among the Holdra. And many of them, well, no, I wouldn't say many. I'm certain there are a few who do not want to shoulder that responsibility and likely seek to have someone else take up the mantle because it's putting you in quite a bind.
There's the old Spider-Man saying, but I would say that in Anacra, great power stems from great responsibility.
Yeah, stems because they're Haldra. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, with the exception of wild magic, which is wild because it has no such obligations.
Yes, exactly. Also, I missed my chance before, but I'm taking it now. One of the things you have to worry about during the spring prom of the Haldra is them. Oh, damn, I messed it up.
Save it for another day.
No, it wouldn't work another day. What's that spell that you hate so much? Spike growth. When people spike growth a punch. Gosh darn it, that's what I was trying to say. Spike growth.
Yeah. All right. No points for delivery, but the joke is actually kind of funny.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. That's yep. Accurate.
Honestly, I think though that the more you talk about the mantles, the more it is you are a living god of some sort.
Yes.
It's a form of divinity. But whenever you're a god, you have to be the god of something, and you are always bound to that thing. Its essence changes you, right? If you become a god of fire, then you're going to become more fiery. Your personality is going to resemble fire in one or more aspects. You cannot have one of these mantles and then just run around neglecting your responsibilities, because part of your soul is now going to push you to fulfill those obligations.
Exactly.
It's not necessarily a lawful thing, because, let's say you inherit one of the Liban mini mantles out there. Well, some of Liban's aspects are being mercurial, being, change as changing as the tides. So you may not go off to do great important things. You may go off to do whatever you feel like, but you are literally bound to do whatever you are obligated to do whatever you feel like by that changing of your nature, by carrying that
Absolutely.
mantle.
And I think this is one of those things where a lot of times when we talk about where we're sometimes we're purposely vague because of how we have to be with these things, but I think a lot of times we come up with some of our or we flesh out our ideas when we do these lore jams.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think one of those things that we may want to focus on right now is we've been pretty vague about like the responsibilities and the duties that come with accepting these mantles. For instance, what sort of duties uh, was Romius forsooking
Mhm.
when he spent 500 years delving into the Emerald Tablets. One of the things we discussed in the past, and I think we should bring up now, is when the firmament was created. When Anacra was put into place, and we discussed it's we never love just throwing numbers around because numbers are math, and math you can work out, and then you can go,
Mhm.
oh, this is very specific about how much this could and couldn't take. But we've estimated that if you would consider the sovereigns being connected to the firmament, and when
Mhm.
Ericor was discorporated, you could say that since there's four of them, the barrier was weakened by about a quarter. And that's one of the reasons why, whether it was incepted, which we don't think, it just kind of is born of necessity. The mantle of power needs to rest somewhere. And it's one of those things where once a candidate that could hold such an office is available, the mantle either will seek it out or could be taken by them in order to be
Mhm.
used. And I think we've talked about how I don't know if we're saying that suzerains are about half as effective as sovereigns. I'd say it's probably a little more than that, but probably not by much.
I would
Uh,
say if we're talking about the integrity of the firmament, right? And Ericur's death, you said a quarter, 25%. The existence
Ish, yeah.
of a suzerain, these are spitball numbers, do not hold us to this math, is somewhere between it's either 15 or 20% effectiveness, right? It all depends on if all four sovereigns got murked and were replaced by suzerains, would the effectiveness of the firmament be reduced to 60% or 80%?
And I think it's somewhere in that regard. To me, if you had somehow knocked off all of the sovereigns and were replaced by suzerains, I feel like the barrier would be about as effective as if you had all if you had all the sovereigns and we're just missing one. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean?
So like
Like
75% ish.
you're still getting like a C plus or a B. Like you're passing the class. You know, the barrier's holding. It's just not impenetrable, you know?
Okay, so a suzerain's power or a suzerain's effectiveness in maintaining the integrity of the firmament is about 75% that of a sovereign. So,
I would agree with that. Yeah.
all right, we can do the fractions later, but like that makes sense. And that isn't to say that an individual suzerain, stat block wise, again, talking about in game, is going to be about 75% as powerful as a sovereign. Because if you're familiar with older editions of D&D, being a suzerain is very much like gaining a template. And so
Yes, exactly.
the power of the suzerain of Earth is going to depend on who is bearing that mantle. When it was Romius, that was a lot closer to sovereign strength because you took a Titan and slapped that mantle on top of him. Okay, that's going to be really, really strong. But I think that that strength, that relative stat block power, is not directly connected to the strength of the firmament. The strength of the firmament has to do with
No,
the
no, no.
mantle being carried by anybody. Anyone who's, as
Exactly.
long as somebody is carrying that mantle, then that effectiveness is still there.
I would say, like we talked about, we don't want to like nail anything down, but I feel like someone like Romius being a one of the first Titans that
Mm-hmm.
was incepted by the sovereigns, that's probably about as close as you can get in
Yeah,
regards to a replacement. And
absolutely.
anything from there is going to start, especially considering we said that Romius was Erakora's like true born Titans. Like a lot of the
Right.
Titans paired off in order to make the elemental Titans of Anacra, whereas Romius, being the cupbearer of the gods, was just fully incepted and created by Erakora.
We,
So that
we,
was about as close as it gets.
we've sort of got a table when it comes to the Titans where it's like, okay, so this is a Titan of earth and fire, and this is a Titan of earth and water. But there's a place on the grid that's earth and earth. And so there is one Titan for each element that is just 100% that element.
Yeah.
Ramius was the 100% earth Titan and therefore would have been the best candidate. But while he had the mantle, he did not, aside from the mantle bearer helping to maintain the integrity of the firmament, which is the barrier that protects the four kingdoms of Anacra from outside incursion, just in case you know, are still here after 45 minutes and have no idea what's going on. The Ramius had other burdens and other responsibilities that he shirked because he believed his research into the elemental tablets was more important. A active Earth suzerain could have used the element of Earth to greater direct effect against the demonic imperiums, against the infernal worshipping empires that ran most of the mortal world during that period. If Ramius had done that instead, then there might have been more client kingdoms that were protected from infernal influence, and the infernal empires might have not grown as strong. That said, he also permanently banished all fiends to the underworld, so there's your trade-off.
Also, we discussed previously about how when Rialta had ascended and had shirked their responsibilities as being the goddess of the pearl, the twilight goddess, is what she became. And that there were other titans that had to kind of come in and assume, okay, well, they had 5 things that they were really working on. So I'll take 2, you guys each take 1, and we'll kind of add that to our domain. Much the same thing had to happen with Ramius, you know, and considering Ramius started off as the cupbearer of the gods, and I know that was a very, you had a lot of plans for that, which I think were changed drastically once one was discorporated, 2 went into hiding, and 1 is now forever at the bottom of the sea, battling for all eternity. So I feel like, thankfully, that role not quite as necessary. Although I think you had a huge connection to the blood, which is why part of the deal with Ramius was kind of safeguarding that. It was kind of like Ramius had it as part of his plan. Like, look, guys, I've like when someone leaves the company and rather than having their job get thrusted upon half their staff, they're like, look, I've already written a program that takes care of it for you. So as long as you just upkeep the program, it'll be fine. No one gets any extra work. I'm thinking that's kind of where we are.
I agree. He basically set up systems to replace himself in that role so he could take on this new duty as Overlord of the Dead.
But that being said, for the 500 or so years that he spent basically in hiding doing his research, maybe not all of the Earth-connected Titans, but probably most of them had to kind of step in, and at least they couldn't. You absolutely couldn't fulfill the firmament portion of the suzerain sovereign role. But my thought would be, much like with the sovereigns actively working towards their own goals, you know, the breeze has to blow, the water has to move. You know, fire has to burn. And even though there are titans that are associated with those things, ultimately, all of that comes from the sovereign. So there has to at least be some energy that is being put forth into just the continuance of Anacra. I mean, if you figure if you actually somehow were able to just completely eradicate not just the avatar, but the spirit and soul of the sovereigns from Anacra, you would effectively kill Anacra.
Yeah, and it would only take 1. You'd only have to permanently delete 1 sovereign. But a lot of those functions operate because, again, Anacra is not destroyed. Anacra is just discorporated.
Exactly.
So even without a suzerain, the basic functions of Earthness will still continue to be performed because Anacra still exists. That's not the purpose of the suzerain.
No. What I guess what I'm saying is not the basic functions. How we talked about how the reason being, why would a sovereign ever have an avatar form? It's because they're enacting change in the world and not just creating big cities in the sky or in the desert and trying to either hide themselves away and gather power or force mortals to rise up. You know, you have these very controlling gods in Sin and Vinder that are trying to see that their agendas are met. But then when you have a more mercurial deity such as Liban, or a more loving or what's a good word for
cultivating, nurturing?
Yeah, nurturing.
It's more cultivating than nurturing, I think, is more Anacra's vibe. Not much come here, your mommy's going to give you a hug, and more like, all right, I'm going to just set everything up, make sure everyone's positioned for success.
Yes, but there are things that need doing in the world that you need an actual body for, like we talked about. Again, grass will grow, you know, fire will burn, you know, without having a suzerain just straight up going, okay, guys, let's check this off the list. Let's make sure. But there are things in the world that will much like how our world naturally over time terraforms and changes. Anacra is not built off the tectonic plates or many of the other rules that our world goes through. And if this world is going to see change, it has to have an overseer seeing about the updating and changing of the world, whether it's the expanding. Patch notes, yeah, making sure that as things change, they are reacting to it or just expanding. I'm not saying this is the case, but there's nothing saying that as time goes on, the actual dimension world of Anacra isn't just slowly either moved out or additions that are made
I don't
by
hate
other.
that. I find that almost hilarious, and I don't hate it. The sphere of Anacra is just slowly
Slowly growing.
expanding.
It
Um,
starts off as this very tiny little King Kai world, and then eventually
mhm.
explodes out.
uh, I'm not gonna sign off on that, but I am gonna ponder my chin at that. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
the other thing is the development of civilization in Anacra was very fast because evolution is still a force that exists in Anacra. Like evolution is still it still happens. Genetic mutation and adaptation, all that stuff still happens. But its effect has been drastically overwhelmed by direct divine meddling. And that's a lot of what Sin was up to, was making sure kickstarting civilization. It's why civilization started so much faster in Anacra than it did in our world, because a lot of things people didn't have to figure out for themselves, they were taught.
Thousands of years instead of billions of years.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to mess with the way that things change, evolve, and
Right.
prosper.
And a lot of land in Anacra was unnaturally set up to support civilization by Arakura's work. That's a lot of what Arakura did, was
Yes.
deliberately cultivating the world. So if all the sovereigns just were immediately discorporated like that, and the world did not get suddenly invaded by anything, it would mostly continue to function just without any major change, right? Because the elements would still be there. They were just discorporated. They're just in the world. Mostly the world would just keep on ticking. There'd be no major changes.
Boy, it would keep on ticking. But the biggest thing, like we talked about, sorry, I don't want to cut you off for the suzerains, is that you would no longer have a feasible barrier surrounding Anacra.
Right.
So it
Well,
would be
I'm saying that
completely
in a
open.
theoretical world where the barrier was fine, but the sovereigns were all discorporated, it would just sort of just keep on
Yes, yeah.
chilling.
If we took that part of it out, yeah, absolutely. It would keep on trucking and be very similar, at least without all the crossing points to our
Mm-hmm.
Earth. But that's really the biggest danger. If you discorporated all the sovereigns without any suzerains to back them up, you would now lose that fine overlaying meshy guard post that is surrounding the
Mm-hmm.
world. And instead of having effective entry points that the celestial sentries are watching over, you would just have a big, huge open area where
Right.
anything from the outer dark can just descend upon it and easily overwhelm any of the celestial guardians that are there. And now, you know, God and everybody is in Anacra now. So
Yeah. It would introduce an absolute age of chaos and alien invasions.
it's almost
um,
like if you took your mask off and walked outside. You know what I mean?
exactly. Exactly.
You don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Keep that sucker keep that sucker on. Keep your sovereigns intact.
Maintain social distance from infernals and mortals alike. So as we get into the last few minutes, I want to say that mantles of power, they run from all the way up to the mantle of elemental sovereignty to become a suzerain, all the way down to just like small things, right? A river spirit, a tree spirit, a hero spirit could grant a mantle of power to a player character. And that would probably take the form of some small buffs or extra class features. If you wanted to play a warlock, you could say that your warlock is just a normal person, but instead of a pact, the mantle, like this person's mantle, is upon you. This dead fiend, this
Yes.
fiend that was discorporated, but its power still lives on, and now its power is invested in you. And so instead of having this patron sitting somewhere cackling in the underworld, you have the fragment of this fiend's spirit whispering to you so that you can become its replacement. You could use that to justify a lot of different character builds. A DM could use it to implement, again, new powers or rewards for a character. You could use it to soup up a bad guy who they've got the mantle of this ancient evil. In some ways, in Arc 2 of Casters and Castles, the Hotan, the great warlord who was a minion of Uzul, Hotan's psyche was unleashed, and Hotan and from prison, and essentially the goal of Hotan was to latch on to somebody else, become a mantle, and use their new influence to empower that person and do all sorts of invasionary crap with it. So it's a really easy plot device to use, and you can stat it out in game all sorts of different ways depending on what's the source of the mantle, how is it passed on. Some might be automatic. It's like, oh crap, you just happened to walk into this room and happened to be a dwarf of the right clan, and so this dormant mantle that's been waiting for the right person just glommed onto you. Or it could be a big ritual. It totally depends from mantle to mantle, much like it varies from god or spirit to god and spirit.
And like we said, when we're talking about the really the big boy mantles, as it were, when it comes to sovereignty or a season or land, those are like very. We mentioned that the mantles kind of give you a sense of divine power. That's not to say that that any old mantle does. Like if you, for instance, one of my players, one of the cool things that we did was when he summoned a there's a spell in 5th edition where you can summon a mount as a paladin. And rather than just summoning a celestial mount and going, hey, cool, I've got a really badass warhorse, he actually went and communed with the spirits of a nearby river and convinced the river spirit to take a corporal form and provide him with a mount that would be able to safeguard him as he traveled through the lands, ridding it of evil that was trying to block off and destroy the river. And so you could end up doing things like that. And that wouldn't be like, oh, you've got a godly horse now. It's it's cool, flavorful things where you don't have to necessarily, if you're creating mantles, it doesn't have to be the end all of this is the greatest thing that's ever benefited anyone ever. It can be very, very small things, like Joe mentioned. House spirits could provide mantles to warriors that are entering battle. Just say, hey, you've got a nice little boost to get you through this. Bring the honor and glory of our family to the forefront and act with both humility and mercy when necessary. Things like that. There can be conditions. I mean, much like how the the deific mantles have restrictions and conditions towards where the power can be used. The same thing can be said for even smaller ones.
Mm-hmm. So it's, I mean, that's pretty much it. It's essentially the idea that divinity is transferable in some cases, and whenever a god or spirit is a role instead of a specific person, you may have a mantle situation. Or if a god or spirit is like it has to be that specific person, and that specific person dies, and that concept still lives on, then the concept can latch on to somebody else to become its new host in a way.
One
It's
of us.
one of
One of
us.
us.
That'll pretty much do it for today's Lunch and Lore. It's good to be back. We're going to continue until further notice on this Friday schedule. And our next topic, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, we're going to be talking about the Fifth Kingdom next, right?
Yeah, it's the fifth kingdom, the one that doesn't exist, from what you said.
Yeah. I think one of the best episodes of Casters and Castles was when the whole party decided to do Mordain tea and just we ad-libbed the entire dream sequence.
Yeah, yeah, that was awesome.
But until next time, I'm going to work on implementing. We have access to a bunch of music now, so I'm going to be working on implementing that for the pre-show. Not that that's a huge issue, but if you're sitting there for 10 minutes, I want you to have something to listen to. We're going to continue to improve our production value, and until next week, this has been Lunch and Lore. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Bye, guys.